In today's rapidly evolving digital landscape, artificial intelligence is shaping the way we access and process information. While AI models like ChatGPT have transformed global communication, China has developed its own powerful AI system, DeepSeek. But what does this mean for information integrity, censorship, and digital rights, especially in the context of authoritarian control? To unpack these concerns, we are joined by Lobsang Gyatso Sither, Director of Technology at the Tibet Action Institute, an organization dedicated to advocating for digital security and freedom of expression in Tibet. We'll discuss how AI-driven censorship, disinformation, and the Chinese government's control over AI models like DeepSeek could impact the future of truth, freedom, and global narratives. Welcome to our program, Lobsang La.
Thank you so much for having me, Padilla.
So I'd like to begin straight away by asking you this. DeepSeek is being called China's answer to ChatGPT. But how does this, it differs in terms of content moderation and censorship?
So thank you so much, Padilla. And I think in your introduction, I think you have really clearly stated what some of the concerns are. And if you look at ChatGPT and comparing it with DeepSeek R1, I think the question is about what law it actually follows, right? So it is very clear that DeepSeek R1 actually follows to the letter what the laws are in China. So it actually follows everything that it is required to do by the Chinese government. So even though we think of DeepSeek R1 or DeepSeek as this large language model that is about for the global audience, for everyone, right? But technically, it is basically a Chinese model that works only for within the Chinese ecosystem, right? It's basically meant to adhere and change global norms around what censorship is, because it is happy to adhere to the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda, or whether it's the Chinese cybersecurity laws. And it actually, even though it is propagated outside, right, it is meant for users outside, it still adheres to the Chinese government laws. So I think that is what the main difference is, right? Because if you look at ChatGPT, right, it looks at information across a very wide spectrum of information that is available globally, and then it makes a determination. And I may not agree with every determination that ChatGPT makes, right? Because like if you're asking certain things about Tibet, it may give you an answer that I may not agree with, but it looks at a holistic approach, right? It looks at all the information that is available across different platforms, across different websites, historical context on Tibet, and then gives you an answer about it. But but DeepSeek, what it does is it basically adheres to the Chinese government's propaganda. So there's a huge difference in terms of how it responds to certain issues.
And in the market, there's a talk about the DeepSeek being one of the cheapest AI model that has been made, and also it does not rely on advanced AI chips, and it's an open source, open code. So my question is, what are the main concerns about the reliability and authenticity of information generated by DeepSeek, as you have mentioned in before just now? So particularly on human rights in China, in Tibet, and Xi Jinping's role.
So I think one of the things that is a huge concern is how DeepSeek talks about issues that are critical of the Chinese government, right? That are issues and how it actually relates to that. So I think there's two different aspects of it, right? Like one is like, how was DeepSeek the learning, right? So for example, as you said, right? So we need to separate those two aspects. So for example, like how much money was spent on DeepSeek, right? To train the language model. So there's the amount that is coming out is about $6 million was spent to train the DeepSeek model. But we should also understand that was only about training the DeepSeek model. It's not about the infrastructure cost. So this is about training the model and how much money it was spent. So there's a question about like the authenticity even of that amount, right? Because we don't have information, because like DeepSeek is still like very, they don't talk much about what they did, how they're doing it, who's behind it, apart from like the owner. So a lot of information about DeepSeek is still censored, even though it's talking about like it's in the global audience. So that's one question, right? The second question is about the content that is generated, right? So for example, a DeepSeek is a large language model. So it's basically like when you ask it a question in very layman's term, when you ask it a question, it gives you an answer. But the answers that it generates about Tibet, right? Sometimes it's like, I don't know what what Tibet is about. Or it talks about the Chinese government stand on Tibet. So I think that is the question of like how content that is generated through DeepSeek doesn't adhere to traditional ways of thinking about how language models work, right? Because when you think about language models, right, it's all about the information that is out there and then trying to give you a precise information how things actually are. But this DeepSeek is all about basically I think in some ways about the Chinese propaganda. It's miniaturizing or like kind of like reflecting what the Chinese government stands are on a number of issues, right? So I think that is the difference in terms of how DeepSeek works versus other language models.
And talking about the Chinese government's propaganda, I'd like to ask, how does the Chinese government's control over AI models like DeepSeek fit into its larger strategy of digital authoritarianism and information warfare, which is going on right now in the world?
So yes, I think that itself is a very important discussion that really needs to be had in the global space, right? Because if you look at DeepSeek, right, and right now DeepSeek has about 5 million users. And if you look at the users, one of the conversations about DeepSeek, right, apart from Tibetans as like us, when we talk about like censorship, everyone else is talking about DeepSeek in terms of how it is able to do so much, how it is able to compare with ChatGPT, how it is able to compare with Gemini, looking at all the different benchmarks, right, of like mathematical, like response time, all those different aspects, right? So no one's talking about how it is censoring content, even though there are some media organization, but the majority of the conversation is about DeepSeek as an AI tool, right? And what that does, it changes global norms around what a tool should be, what an AI tool should be, right? So what is happening now is like people are willing to use DeepSeek with oh, it doesn't matter if it's like echoing Chinese government propaganda. It doesn't matter if it's censoring. So that is something that is changing the global norms about what freedom means, what human rights mean, and what digital authoritarianism and how that means in the global context, right? So, for example, recently in the US, right, when TikTok was banned for one day, right, how many Americans moved to Red Note? There was thousands and hundreds of thousands of Americans who actually said, "Oh, we're going to move to Red Note," which is a Chinese app, and that app is completely censored. The other aspect is if you look at TikTok and Douyin, there's a huge difference. Douyin is the TikTok that is available for Tibetans inside Tibet and for Chinese. However, TikTok is the global app. There's a difference in these two apps, right? How they operate. Douyin has a lot of censorship. There's a lot of surveillance. There's a lot of like censorship of Tibetan language, as all of us know. But on TikTok, a lot of that is very kind of like muted, right? So it's not like doesn't overtly censor Tibetan content, doesn't overtly censor criticisms of Xi Jinping or the Chinese government, but it does censor certain things, right? But that is different. Now with DeepSeek as well as like with Red Note, it is being pushed to the global audience with all the censorship mechanisms of the Chinese government. So it is a Chinese app that is pushed to the global audience, but regulated by the Chinese government. So that's a huge difference. And the conversation needs to be about that, how China is able to change the global norms around censorship and human rights.
And so, what are the risks for Tibetans and human rights activists if such AI models become widely used, both inside Tibet and globally?
I think inside Tibet, as you said, right, like if such AI models are used more widely, I think inside Tibet, I think we know the consequences, right? There's no access to information. So there's always a bit of a distrust inside Tibet in terms of some of those information. So I think that is always going to be a push and pull in terms of how people trust these tools, right? So, for example, it is very commonly known that Tibetans inside Tibet, when they are communicating on WeChat, right, they know that there's censorship, they know that it's surveilled, right? So that kind of knowledge is much better inside Tibet. But now, if you think about the global audience, right, and right now, how we use AI is different than how AI is going to be used in the future, right? So, for example, like currently, a lot of the AI that we use, whether it's ChatGPT, Claude AI, we use it mostly for like small things, right? Just asking certain elements of it, but we don't use it as our day-to-day information source because like we still use Google, right? So for example, if someone in the outside world, right, in the global context is looking for information about Tibet, they will use Google to talk about what the issue of Tibet is, right? And they'll get a lot of information. They'll also get Chinese government sources, but they'll get a lot of international government sources, UN sources, all of that, right? And they will be able to make their own determination on what is the truth. And they will look at all these different information and be able to determine on their own what the truth is, that Tibet is an occupied nation and the repression Tibetans face inside Tibet. All of that information will be available to them. However, with AI and the changing scenario of how AI is being used more and more, that is also in some ways thinking about how it might replace traditional forms of search. And that is where I think the question becomes like, okay, if someone is asking about Tibet with ChatGPT, the answer is different. But if DeepSeek and models like this, which echo Chinese government censorship and propaganda, become to tend to be more widely used in the world, the moment you ask questions about Tibet, that the answer will be a Chinese government propaganda. And how many people in the next 5 years or the next 10 years, where the generation will be using AI as a Google search, AI as the source of information, AI as their kind of like actual truth, will actually think that is the truth and not look further. So I think there is a huge challenge there. Yes.
And what steps can be taken to counteract the spread of disinformation, like you have just mentioned, for the future generations, and ensure AI technology remains a tool for truth rather than state propaganda?
Yes, and I think what we Tibetans are doing right now, I think it's like actually like whether it's through social media, whether it's trying to get more and more media coverage on issues, what DeepSeek is doing, right, in terms of censorship and propaganda. I think that is one of the first steps that we have to take. And the second step is which is a bit more challenging, but it's about working with a lot of like Western governments to understand how these technologies are changing global norms and how they need to make laws and regulations which restrict the spread of tools which don't adhere to international standards, which have inbuilt censorship and surveillance, right? So I think those are some of the things that a lot of the countries have to do. So something along the lines of what I sometimes think about is kind of like the reciprocal act, right? For Tibetans, right? Like when the US passed the reciprocal act for Tibetans, it was like if the Chinese government is not going to allow Tibetans who are born in the West or others or like government officials, US government officials go to Tibet, they will restrict Chinese officials from coming to the US, right? So very in similar ways, right? What about ChatGPT? What about all these different tools? How are they able to operate in China or in Tibet? They're not able to operate, right? So unless there's a reciprocal access, why should Chinese apps, which do not adhere to the US laws or international standards, be allowed to operate globally? So I think there has to be a discussion about how to do that within the framework of a law and regulation that protects human rights, not in just saying like, okay, we'll block this or block that, but it has to go through laws and regulations which will allow the global norms to remain and allow global norms to still think about human rights and freedom of expression without kind of like making sure that like these apps don't become the norm in the global space. And that will completely change how we think about truth.
So, Lobsang, these are my questions for this conversation. But if you have any additional information that is not included in my questions, you can add now.
I think one thing I wanted to talk about was like we talk about DeepSeek AI, right? And right now, like when we're talking about DeepSeek, this is more like a language model. So the impacts of language models is huge. However, I think for Tibetans inside Tibet, we also have to look at how a lot of other AI tools, right? Whether it's automated voice to text, right? Tibetan voice to text, automated like how Tibetan voice can be converted to text automatically or to translate it to Chinese, how those are used to censor Tibetans inside Tibet, how CCTVs are able to identify Tibetans. So I think there's a lot of impacts of AI apart from language models that is going to impact Tibetans inside Tibet. And there is a conversation about how some of these tools have no ethical and moral standards, and how that has to be a global discussion about how a lot of the AI tools have to have certain ethical standards, right? And maybe this is something that's not going to happen in China, but we also have to understand a lot of these tools are built with support from a lot of like institutions, a lot of companies that need to be held accountable. So I think that is something that we need to look at, how Tibetans inside Tibet are being impacted by AI, if you don't even consider DeepSeek, but AI in the traditional sense, and how that is impacting Tibetans inside Tibet, and how we need to make sure that our companies and institutions, right? So for example, like a lot of these big institutions that supply tools to China, how that is impacting Tibetans inside Tibet. So I think that is something that we need to start looking more at.
So, Lobsang, thank you so much for taking out your time today for this conversation. This has been very informative and a much-needed discussion today as the information war is going on in the world right now, and the impacts of disinformation by AI. So, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me, Bandela. And I hope this conversation will lead to more conversations about how we, as Tibetans, can really have an impact in this conversation and make sure that this is something that doesn't become the global norm and really change how we look at information and disinformation. Thank you so much.
With this, we have come to the end of today's program of In Conversation with Tibettv. Thank you so much for watching.